A billionaire's autistic son was born paralyzed, a condition doctors said would never improve. For years, specialists tried everything, but the boy remained silent and unable to move. His father, one of the richest men in the world, spared no effort. He built therapy rooms, hired world-class doctors, and spent millions looking for answers. Nothing worked. Then, a new maid was hired. She wasn't a nurse, she wasn't a doctor, just someone with patience and attention. But within weeks, she noticed something no one else had. A small reaction. A sound, a smile. She kept observing, and slowly, piece by piece, uncovered the real reason behind the boy's condition. What she discovered shocked everyone, and would change the boy's life forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Wakefield was once a powerful businessman known across the world. People saw him on magazine covers and admired his success. But now, at 43, Richard was no longer in the spotlight. He lived quietly in a huge mansion, far from interviews and cameras. That mansion, full of expensive things, felt empty, without laughter or company. It was a lonely place. Richard had made a lot of money with smart strategies and long hours of work, but those things didn't matter anymore. His wife had passed away, and since then he focused only on his son, Noah. Noah was 6 years old. He had autism, used a wheelchair, and had Down syndrome. Richard had hired doctors, bought the best equipment, and worked with many therapists. He tried everything, but Noah never spoke. Richard, once cold and strong in business meetings, felt weak now. The silence from his son hurt more than any loss or failure he had faced before. Every day, Richard followed the same routine. He woke up early, helped Noah get ready, and made breakfast himself. He didn't trust anyone else with his son. They sat at a long table, but Noah never looked at him. Richard spoke gently, asked questions, and told small stories. Noah stayed quiet, eyes focused on nothing in particular. After breakfast, Richard pushed his wheelchair into the therapy room, a space filled with colorful toys, machines, and tools. Therapists came and went, trying different methods, pictures, sounds, even animals. But Noah remained still and silent. Richard watched every session, hoping to see a reaction, even a small one. Sometimes Noah flinched or looked around, but he never spoke. Richard often asked himself what he was doing wrong. He wanted to connect. He wanted to hear his son's voice. Not for recognition or reward, just to know that Noah was there inside and trying. The silence felt like a wall Richard couldn't break. Richard's mind was full of questions and worries. He read every article and book he could find about children like Noah. He talked to doctors, traveled for consultations, and bought the newest devices. He spared no expense, hoping one of them might finally help his son communicate. He tried speech therapy, music therapy, even sign language. Nothing worked. Each failed attempt brought disappointment, but Richard never stopped. He remembered how easy it had been to control business deals, how simple numbers and logic had seemed. But now, with his own son, none of that helped. Noah didn't respond to logic or money. Richard spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds from the baby monitor next to his bed. He worried about the future. What would happen to Noah when he wasn't around anymore? Who would care for him? The thought filled Richard with fear. He felt helpless, something he had never felt before in his life. Despite everything, Richard didn't give up. Each morning he tried again. He talked to Noah as if he could understand every word. He told him about the weather, the trees outside, and even stories from when he was a child. He played music in the background, soft, calm songs he thought Noah might like. Sometimes he played games, hoping Noah would show interest. He even tried cooking new meals, thinking different smells or textures might spark something. A smile, a noise, a glance, Anything would be enough. But the silence continued. Noah showed no signs that he was listening. Richard began to feel like he was the only one trying. He felt like he was living in a world where only he spoke, and Noah didn't want to join in. Yet he kept trying, not because he had hope of change, but because it was the only way he knew to show love. Silence or not, Noah was his son. Some days were harder than others. Richard would feel frustration rise, but he always held it back. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. He knew it wasn't Noah's fault. When therapists failed, Richard didn't blame them. Instead, he would thank them and continue searching. He learned patience in a way he never had before. In business, time was money. At home, time was simply waiting for something to happen. Waiting for a moment that might never come. Richard had meetings with specialists who told him not to expect too much. They used soft words like acceptance and realistic expectations. Richard listened but didn't fully agree. Deep down, he believed that Noah was capable of more. He just didn't know how to reach him. Every small moment, a movement of Noah's hand, a change in expression, was studied closely. Richard was always looking for clues, signs, or patterns. It became his full-time job, more important than anything he had done before. One afternoon, as sunlight entered the wide windows of the mansion, Richard sat beside Noah in the living room. He was tired, but he didn't show it. He placed a small toy in Noah's hand and watched. Noah didn't react. Minutes passed. Then Richard began speaking softly, like always. He told a story about his wife, about how she had loved music. He described a day at the beach long ago before Noah was born. His voice was calm and slow. He didn't expect a reply. He just wanted to be close. He looked at Noah and smiled gently. Noah didn't look back. His eyes remained distant. The toy slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Richard picked it up and gave it back to him. Still no reaction. He sighed and leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. The silence between them continued. And in that silence, more than anything, Richard felt the weight of being a father who only wanted one thing: to hear his son say a single word. Julia Bennett was 27 years old and had just experienced the worst moment of her life. Not long ago, her newborn daughter died. It happened suddenly, and nothing could have prepared her for the pain. Since then, Julia had been trying to stay strong. She didn't talk much about it. Most people around her avoided the topic. The silence made it worse. She spent days at home, not knowing what to do, unable to sleep well or eat properly. After a few weeks, she decided she needed to do something to feel alive again. That was when she found the job offer. It wasn't glamorous or exciting, but it was a fresh start. She accepted a position as a housemaid at the Wakefield mansion. Julia didn't care about the size of the house or who lived there. She just wanted peace and routine. With quiet determination, she packed her few belongings and took a bus toward the new place. When Julia arrived at the mansion, she noticed how quiet it was. Everything was perfectly clean and well organized, but there was a strange feeling in the air, like the house was frozen in time. A man greeted her, Richard Wakefield. He was polite but distant, speaking clearly and without emotion. He explained her duties and told her about his son Noah. Julia listened without interrupting. She had worked in other homes before, but something about this job felt different. As she walked through the hallways and rooms, she noticed how many things were made for a child: therapy equipment, colorful books, toys, soft chairs. But there was no noise, no laughter. Later, when she saw Noah for the first time, he was sitting quietly in his wheelchair, not looking at anyone. Julia didn't say anything. She simply nodded to Richard and began her tasks. She didn't feel nervous. She knew she had come there for a reason, even if she didn't know what it was yet. Julia didn't act like the other staff who had worked there before. She didn't treat Noah with fake kindness or forced smiles. She didn't speak to him loudly or try to get a reaction. She simply did her work and stayed close when needed. Sometimes she cleaned the room while Noah was present. She made sure not to make loud noises or move quickly. She noticed how easily he became overwhelmed, but she also noticed how calm he became when someone didn't force anything on him. So she respected that. When she finished her tasks, she sometimes sat on a chair nearby, doing nothing in particular, just being present. Noah didn't look at her, but he didn't seem bothered by her presence either. Richard watched this from a distance. He was surprised. Most new workers tried too hard or gave up quickly. Julia didn't do either. She was just there, calmly, without questions or expectations. And somehow, that started to matter. Over the next few days, Richard started to notice small changes. Julia was quiet, but her presence seemed to bring a different energy to the house. It wasn't that Noah reacted to her in any big way. He still didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, and barely moved, but something felt easier. He no longer turned away when she entered the room. He no longer stiffened when she placed something near him. It was hard to explain, but Richard felt it. One day, Julia placed a small toy in front of Noah. She didn't say anything, just left it there and returned to her cleaning. Noah didn't touch it, but he looked at it for a few seconds longer than usual. Richard saw it. Julia didn't point it out or make a comment. She just continued her work. That simple, respectful approach was new. Richard had never seen someone handle things like that before. It made him curious about who Julia really was. Richard slowly began to talk more with Julia. It wasn't much at first, just small comments, polite questions. But she answered with honesty and never tried to impress him. Eventually, she told him about her daughter. She didn't cry or ask for sympathy. She just explained it, like someone who had accepted something painful but wanted to keep moving. Richard was surprised by her honesty. He didn't know what to say, but Julia didn't seem to need comfort. She just wanted to be understood. That made him respect her more. Over time, Julia became more than just a housemaid. She became a part of the house's quiet routine. She fit into the silence instead of trying to break it. Richard appreciated that. He'd grown used to being alone with Noah, thinking no one else could understand. But Julia didn't try to understand everything. She just stayed, and that was enough. Her presence didn't fix anything, but it helped. The most surprising thing happened on a regular afternoon. Julia was folding laundry in the living room while Noah sat nearby, staring out the window. Without thinking much, she began humming softly. It wasn't a song with words, just a simple melody. Richard walked in and paused. He expected Noah to ignore it like always. But this time, Noah moved his head slightly. It was almost nothing, just a small tilt toward the sound. Julia didn't even look up, she just kept humming. Richard stood still, not wanting to interrupt. After a minute, Noah's fingers twitched a little. Again, it wasn't much, but to Richard it was everything. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, something was changing. Julia didn't celebrate. She didn't say anything afterward. She just kept working like usual. But in that small moment, Richard realized the silence between them all had shifted a little, and it had started the day Julia arrived at the mansion. Over time, Julia started noticing small things in Noah's behavior. At first, they didn't seem important. But the more time she spent with him, the more she began to pick up on patterns. Noah had his own way of reacting to the world. He didn't talk, didn't make eye contact, and rarely moved much. But there were little signs. He would turn his head slightly when certain noises happened, like when someone poured a glass of water or when it rained outside. He didn't react the same way to music or voices, but sounds related to water made him seem more awake. Julia started testing this. She would run the faucet slowly when cleaning, and she noticed his fingers moved more when he heard it. When it rained, she would open a window just a bit, and Noah would sit more calmly. It wasn't much, but Julia paid attention. She didn't rush anything. She just kept observing day by day. One afternoon, she was pushing Noah's wheelchair through the garden behind the mansion. It was a quiet area with trimmed grass, bushes, and a few tall trees. The air was warm, and the sky was clear. As they walked, Julia noticed a slight change in Noah's posture. He was sitting a little straighter and moving his fingers. She followed his gaze and saw he was looking toward the pool at the far end of the garden. The water made soft, splashing noises as the filter system moved it around. Julia stopped the wheelchair. Noah kept looking at the water. His lips were closed, but there was a very faint smile. His hands moved again, just slightly, but enough to show that something was happening inside him. Julia leaned down and said quietly, "You like that, huh?" She didn't expect a reply, of course, but she felt like he understood. That simple moment made her feel hopeful. Maybe she had found something that truly reached him. From that day on, Julia made a small change in their daily routine. Every morning after breakfast and before the therapy session, she took Noah outside for a short walk to the pool area. She didn't force anything. If Noah didn't want to go one day, she wouldn't push it. But most days, he stayed calm during the trip. When they got close to the water, she would park his wheelchair nearby under some shade. They sat there for a while, listening. Sometimes the wind moved the water a little. Sometimes birds landed close. Noah still didn't speak or react like other kids, but his body language was different now. He seemed more comfortable. He wasn't as stiff. His fingers moved slowly, rhythmically. Julia noticed he didn't blink as much. He was focused. She didn't try to make it more than what it was. But it was clear something inside Noah responded to the sound and movement of the water. As the days passed, Julia started seeing even more signs. Noah's shoulders relaxed near the water. Once, when she gently splashed her hand into the pool, he turned his head quickly toward the sound. It was the fastest reaction she had ever seen from him. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just kept doing what felt natural. Sometimes she would sit next to him and let her fingers tap the edge of the pool. Occasionally, she spoke softly to him, not expecting a response, just keeping him company. She noticed his breathing became slower during these moments. One day while she was cleaning near the garden later in the afternoon, Noah made a soft sound. It wasn't a word, just a noise, but it was new. It came right after they returned from the pool. Julia froze. She didn't know what it meant, but it felt like something important. She didn't tell Richard yet. She wanted to be sure. Julia started asking herself deeper questions. What if the pool was more than just something Noah liked? What if it could become a tool, a way to connect with him more directly? She had read that water therapy sometimes helped children with special needs, especially those with sensory issues. The feeling of water, the sounds it made, and the gentle pressure could be calming or even stimulating. But she didn't want to get ahead of herself. She knew how easy it was to see meaning where there was none. Still, the signs were there. She considered speaking to Richard, but she hesitated. He had seen so many professionals try and fail. She didn't want to be just another person with a suggestion that led nowhere. But inside, she felt like this wasn't just a guess. It was something real. She had watched Noah closely, and this wasn't just coincidence. There was joy, real joy, in those small hand movements and slight smiles. One morning, after a night of thinking, Julia decided to bring it up. Richard was in his office, going through documents. She knocked and waited. When he looked up, she entered and spoke carefully. She told him what she had seen, how Noah responded to the pool, how his hands moved differently, how his body relaxed. She mentioned the sound of water and how Noah seemed drawn to it. Richard listened without interrupting. He didn't react strongly, but he didn't brush it off either. After a pause, he said, "Let's try something." That afternoon, the three of them went outside. Julia led Noah's wheelchair while Richard walked beside them. They sat near the pool like before. Julia touched the water and made small splashes. Noah watched, just as he had before. Richard leaned down and looked at his son. He saw the movement in the hands. He saw the small smile. And for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, something was finally starting to change. It was a hot, late afternoon, and the sun still hung above the backyard when Julia decided it was time to try something new. She had thought about it for days, maybe even weeks. Every time she and Noah visited the pool, he showed more comfort, more interest. He moved his hands more, breathed calmly, and sometimes made soft sounds. But today felt different. Julia had a small flotation vest ready. She had asked permission from Richard earlier in the week, and though he didn't say yes directly, he also didn't say no. That was enough for her. She carefully helped Noah into the vest, checking every strap and making sure it fit snugly. He didn't resist, which already felt like a win. With slow movements, she sat by the edge of the pool, holding him close. Then, keeping one arm tightly around him, she slowly stepped down into the water, both of them entering together for the first time. Noah's body reacted immediately to the water. His arms tensed, and he pulled his shoulders up slightly. Julia held him tighter. "It's okay, I've got you," she whispered. She didn't rush anything. They stayed by the pool's edge for a few moments, letting him get used to the new feeling. The water reached his chest, and she could feel him trembling slightly. But he didn't scream. He didn't panic. Slowly, his body adjusted. Julia moved backward just a little, letting the water carry more of his weight. The float kept him up, and her arm stayed firmly around his waist. After a few more seconds, something changed. His shoulders dropped, his hands moved through the water gently, and his head tilted back. Then, out of nowhere, he let out a small, quick laugh. It was a short, clear giggle. Julia froze, her eyes wide. She had never heard that sound from him before. Her heart jumped. For a moment, Julia didn't know what to do. Her chest tightened, and she felt a strange mix of happiness and fear. She didn't want to scare him by reacting too much. But she couldn't help it. Her eyes filled with tears, and a quiet laugh escaped her lips. She kept holding him, floating slowly in the water, moving in small circles. Noah didn't laugh again, but his face stayed calm. He seemed to enjoy it. He wasn't stiff. His fingers moved along the surface of the water, feeling it, splashing just a bit. Julia watched every small movement like it was the most important thing in the world. She thought about all the days she had sat near this pool with him, hoping for something, anything. And now, here he was, floating, relaxed and laughing. It was just one sound, but to her, it meant everything. She whispered to him again, "You did it, Noah. You really did it." He hadn't planned to go outside, but something had made him stop working and look through the window. He had seen Julia walking Noah toward the pool earlier and felt unsure about it. Now, curious, he stepped outside and followed the path. As he reached the edge of the yard, he stopped. In front of him, just a few meters away, he saw his son in the water, floating, being held by Julia. He couldn't move for a second, his eyes focused on the boy's face. He saw the way Noah moved his hands. He saw the way Julia held him with care. Then he heard the sound. Noah laughed again, just once, short and light. It was faint but clear. Richard's heart pounded. He couldn't believe it. His son was laughing. In water. With someone else. With her. At first, Richard's reaction was confusion. He didn't know what to feel. He had always been protective, cautious, maybe even too controlling. He never trusted anyone fully with Noah. And now, here was Julia, doing something he had never managed to do. She had taken his son into the water without fear. She had made him laugh. Richard took a step closer but didn't interrupt. He kept watching, realizing something was happening that he couldn't ignore. His fear, the fear that something would go wrong, that Noah would get hurt, that people wouldn't understand, began to fade. He saw that Julia wasn't forcing anything. She was calm, patient, and fully focused on Noah. She was helping him feel safe. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had waited years for a moment like this, and it wasn't happening in therapy, or with a doctor, or in some special program. It was happening right here, in his backyard, with a woman who simply cared. As Julia turned toward the garden and saw Richard standing there, she froze for a second, but then she nodded gently, as if asking for his silent approval. He didn't speak. He simply nodded back and walked a little closer, still keeping distance. Noah didn't notice. He was focused on the water, on the feeling of floating, and on Julia's arm around him. Richard sat down slowly on a nearby chair, watching the scene unfold. He didn't try to take control. He just watched. The tension between him and Julia had always been unspoken, full of limits and formal lines. But now, something had changed. This wasn't about roles or titles anymore. This was about Noah. And for the first time, he was smiling. Julia continued moving slowly through the water with the boy, her expression soft and emotional. And Richard, sitting there, finally understood. This wasn't just a swim. It was the beginning of something much bigger than fear. Richard walked slowly toward the pool. His steps were steady, but his heart was beating fast. He had just seen his son laugh for the first time. That alone had shaken something inside him. Now, as he got closer, his eyes stayed on Noah. The boy was still floating in the water, supported by Julia, who held him with calm and care. Richard didn't want to interrupt. He didn't want to break whatever was happening. He stayed quiet, watching every movement. Julia didn't say a word either. She kept Noah close, her hands steady. Then, something unexpected happened. As Richard stood near the edge, Noah turned his head toward him. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Their eyes met, and then in a soft voice, Noah said, "Daddy." Just one word. It was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it was clear. Richard froze. His body went still. His eyes widened. He had waited years for this moment. The word echoed in Richard's mind. "Daddy." He couldn't believe it. He stared at Noah, hoping he had heard right, afraid to even breathe in case it was just his imagination. But it was real. It had happened. Richard's legs gave out and he dropped to his knees by the edge of the pool. His hands trembled. He didn't care about his clothes getting wet or how he looked. Tears streamed down his face without control. Years of pain, frustration, fear, and helplessness came pouring out. He had lived in silence for so long, thinking his son might never speak. He had accepted it, or at least told himself he had. But now, with just one word, everything changed. Julia stayed still in the water, her arms around Noah. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes met Richard's, and they both understood the weight of that moment. Nothing needed to be explained. It was the kind of moment that spoke for itself. Noah didn't repeat the word, but he looked calm. His fingers were still moving slightly in the water, and his breathing was steady. He didn't seem afraid or confused. In fact, he looked more present than ever before. Julia gently adjusted her hold on him to keep him comfortable. Richard wiped his face with both hands, trying to catch his breath. He looked at his son again, studying every detail of his face. Noah wasn't just reacting to the water or a moment of comfort. He had made a connection. He had looked at his father and chosen to speak. That meant more than any therapy report or medical update ever had. Richard reached out and touched Noah's hand, slowly, carefully. Noah didn't pull away. He let his hand rest there, soft and light. Richard turned to Julia and said in a quiet voice, "Thank you." She didn't answer. She just nodded once, her expression gentle and steady. Richard sat on the ground beside the pool, not ready to stand. He wanted to stay close. He wanted to remember every second. He watched his son floating, still held safely in Julia's arms. For the first time, he didn't feel powerless. He didn't feel lost or unsure. He felt connected. He realized something important. Noah had never been incapable of speaking. He had never been completely closed off. He had just never felt safe enough to let something out. It wasn't about teaching him or fixing him. It was about giving him space. A space without pressure. A space where silence wasn't a failure. Julia had created that space with simple actions. Patience, presence, calm. Richard had spent years looking for solutions in expensive places, chasing results. But the answer had been something smaller and quieter. The freedom to feel safe, to express. Richard watched Noah move in the water, and for the first time he believed in real progress. Julia continued to float with Noah for a few more minutes. She didn't rush anything. She could feel the change in the boy's posture. He trusted her. His body was relaxed. He wasn't just tolerating the experience, he was participating in it. Every small movement he made felt intentional. Julia looked at Richard again, and this time she saw something new in his face. It wasn't just shock or emotion, it was understanding. He had seen what she had been noticing for weeks, that Noah wasn't unreachable, that the silence wasn't a wall, it was a protection. And now, for the first time, that protection had started to come down. They stayed in that moment a little longer, no one in a hurry to move. It was like everything had paused around them, giving space for this one truth. Noah had spoken, not just with his mouth, but with his whole presence. And that moment had changed everything for all of them. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Julia slowly guided Noah back toward the edge of the pool. She helped him out gently, drying him with a towel she had prepared. Richard stood and took the towel from her, finishing the job silently. Together, they dressed him and placed him in his wheelchair. Noah was calm, his head tilted slightly, his eyes open and alert. Richard looked down at him, still unable to believe what had happened. One word had broken through years of silence, but more than that, it had opened a new door. He looked at Julia, and something in his heart shifted. He no longer saw her as just an employee. She had done something no expert had ever done. She had reached his son. And right there, with the last bit of sunlight touching the ground, Richard understood. Something had awakened today, in Noah, in himself and in Julia. Something real, something alive. The pool had slowly become the most important part of the house. What once was just a quiet backyard feature was now the center of Noah's world. Each morning after breakfast, he would smile and point toward the glass door leading to the backyard. Sometimes he would tap the armrest of his wheelchair and look at Julia, waiting for her to understand. It didn't take much. Julia knew exactly what he wanted. Richard watched this change with quiet amazement. Noah, who once showed no clear interest in anything, now had a routine he enjoyed. The moment they stepped outside, Noah would sit up straighter. His eyes would focus, and his hands would move gently in the air. He started making soft sounds as they approached the pool, almost like humming. It was his way of expressing excitement. Richard joined them often now, standing nearby or sitting on the edge, soaking in each small piece of progress like it was something sacred. Julia began to bring new elements to their sessions by the pool. She introduced water games with floating toys, some soft, some colorful, some that made gentle noises when squeezed. She also played calm music in the background, sometimes singing quietly to Noah. He reacted more and more. He reached for the toys, splashed softly, and even laughed at times. One toy in particular, a yellow plastic duck, caught his attention. He held it longer than the others and watched it float with focus. Julia noticed and used it often in their time together. She also brought books with simple pictures, reading them aloud near the water's edge. Sometimes she pointed to images and named them, pausing to see if Noah would react. And he did. He would touch the pictures, make small sounds, or tap the pages. These weren't random movements anymore. They were clear responses. Communication had started. Richard, always nearby, observed with silent gratitude, slowly realizing how much his son had been waiting to be understood. Then, during one of those afternoon sessions, something incredible happened. Julia sat on a towel beside the pool with Noah in his chair next to her. She handed him the familiar yellow duck. Noah looked at it, then looked at her. Without hesitation, he pointed at the toy and said, "Duck." His voice was quiet but clear. Julia froze. She wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "Duck," she repeated, pointing to it again. Noah looked at the toy and nodded slightly. "Duck," he said again. It was the second word he had ever spoken. Julia smiled, holding back tears, and turned to Richard, who had seen and heard everything from just a few steps away. His expression changed instantly, shock, joy, disbelief, all mixed into one. He walked over and knelt beside Noah. "That's right," he said softly. "Duck." It was a moment of celebration, not because of the word alone, but because of what it meant. Noah was learning to speak, and more importantly, he was choosing to. After that day, the sessions near the pool became even more special. Richard made time for them every afternoon, no matter how busy his schedule was. He no longer watched from a distance. He participated. He helped dry off toys, sat on the floor to read stories, and even joined the games when he felt confident enough. Julia kept guiding things calmly, never forcing progress, always letting Noah set the pace. The boy responded with smiles, noises, and more eye contact than ever before. He didn't say many more words, but he was clearly communicating. When he was happy, he made sounds and flapped his hands. When he was confused, he looked at Julia for direction. When he liked a story, he touched the page and gave a small laugh. These were small things to others, but to Richard and Julia, they were major steps. The pool area had become more than just a place to play. It was where Noah felt safe, connected, and free. Julia began keeping a notebook. Every time Noah made a new sound, pointed at something, or responded to a story, she wrote it down. She shared the notes with Richard, who read each page carefully. They talked about new strategies, new books to try, and different toys to introduce. They worked like a team, always focusing on what Noah enjoyed most. One day, Julia brought finger paints to the poolside, spreading a plastic mat on the ground. She guided Noah's hands through the colors, and to their surprise, he didn't pull away. He touched the paper, smeared blue and yellow together, and even smiled when Richard dipped his own fingers into the paint. Another time, they played with bubbles, and Noah reached for them with genuine excitement. These activities weren't just for fun. They were building blocks. Each one taught Noah something: cause and effect, texture, communication. And slowly, his own way of talking was becoming clearer every day. The words still came slowly, and most of the time, Noah used gestures, facial expressions, and simple sounds. But that didn't matter anymore. Richard and Julia had learned to listen differently. They no longer expected full sentences or perfect pronunciation. They understood the pauses, the hand movements, the quiet laughs. It was a new kind of language, one built with patience and trust. For the first time, Noah wasn't being taught how to be someone else. He was being supported to be himself. Richard finally saw that his son didn't need to be fixed. He needed to be heard. He needed people to meet him where he was, not where they expected him to be. And Julia had given him that. She had created a bridge between silence and understanding. That afternoon, as the three of them sat by the pool, Noah leaned his head against Julia's arm. She smiled. Richard smiled too. The words were rare, but the connection was real. The boy was finally being heard. While organizing some shelves in the office, Julia came across a locked drawer. She found the key in the top drawer of Richard's desk and opened it without thinking much. Inside, there were several old folders and envelopes. Most of them were unimportant: bills, insurance documents, papers from the past, but one folder stood out. It was labeled Noah Medical History. Julia hesitated before opening it. When she did, she saw dozens of reports from a neurologist who had treated Noah for years. As she read through them, her face changed. The reports described procedures and medications that didn't make sense to her. Words like emotional containment, compliance reinforcement, and behavioral suppression were used repeatedly. The doctor had prescribed heavy medication for long periods, not for treatment, but for control. Julia's hands trembled as she kept reading. There were notes about limiting stimuli, isolating Noah during episodes, and even restricting physical contact. The reports felt cold and inhuman. Something was very wrong. Julia couldn't ignore what she had read. The more pages she turned, the worse it got. One report even mentioned using a restraint chair during sessions to ensure safety and limit resistance. There were notes suggesting that Noah's silence was permanent and that language development is unlikely. But what bothered her the most was how all these decisions had been accepted without question. Noah had been treated as a problem to be controlled, not a child to be understood. Julia dug deeper. She looked up the neurologist's name online and found articles, reviews, and medical board complaints. To her horror, she discovered several families had spoken out about similar experiences. Children who had been over-medicated, kids who had suffered side effects, both physical and emotional. The doctor had faced investigations in the past, but had continued practicing. Julia felt sick. She closed the folder and sat in silence, trying to decide what to do. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. Later that evening, Julia waited until Noah was asleep. She walked into Richard's study, folder in hand. He was sitting on the couch reading when he looked up and saw her serious expression. She sat across from him and began to explain everything she had found. She didn't hold back. She read him the most disturbing parts of the reports and showed him the research she had done. Richard listened quietly at first, then grew visibly shaken. His face turned pale, and he sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands covering his mouth. He had trusted that doctor. For years he believed he was doing what was best for his son. Now he realized he had allowed treatments that might have hurt Noah. He had paid for it, signed the papers, and never asked enough questions. He felt guilt creeping in fast, heavier than anything he had felt before. His voice cracked when he finally asked, "How could I not have known?" She saw the pain in his eyes and understood how easy it was to trust people in white coats with serious titles. But she also believed it was time to act. Richard agreed. They couldn't stay quiet. Together, they made a plan. First, they gathered every document, printed every article, and saved testimonies from other families. Then, they contacted a lawyer who specialized in medical ethics and malpractice. They also reached out to a journalist who had written pieces about flawed medical systems. It wasn't just about Noah anymore. They wanted to make sure other children wouldn't go through the same nightmare. The process was slow and emotionally draining. They gave interviews, wrote statements, and supported the investigation. Every time they revisited the files, Richard felt the guilt return, but he didn't run from it. This was his chance to fix what he had allowed for too long. He knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth and protection. At home, despite the tension of the case, life with Noah continued to move forward. Julia and Richard didn't let their mission interfere with his daily routine. In fact, they became more present than ever. Every small moment with him felt even more important now. Noah kept making progress. He still preferred gestures and sounds, but now he made eye contact more often. He pointed to things he wanted and even tried new words once in a while. One day, while playing near the water, he said "ball" while holding one. Another time, he reached for a book and said "read." Each moment was a reminder that his mind was working, learning, and growing. He wasn't broken. He had never been. Richard looked at him differently now, not with pity or worry, but with respect. Julia noticed it too. The trauma from the past was real, but it wasn't the end of the story. Noah's future was still wide open. Months passed, and the case moved forward. News stories were published, and more families came forward. The doctor's license was suspended while the investigation continued. Richard and Julia were called to speak publicly more than once. Though it was hard, they didn't back down. They spoke for Noah and for every child who had been treated like a case file instead of a person. At home, their bond with each other grew stronger. They were no longer employer and employee. They were a team bound by the shared goal of protecting someone they both loved deeply. Noah, unaware of the storm his parents were fighting outside, kept discovering his world, one little step at a time. His smile came more easily now. He laughed more. And when he said Julia for the first time, it was clear to both of them, this boy, once silenced by fear and misunderstanding, was finding his voice. Slowly but surely, Noah was being set free. With the support of other parents, Richard and Julia moved forward with everything they had. What began as a quiet search for answers had become a public mission for justice. They met with families who had also experienced the same mistreatment under the same doctor. They listened to heartbreaking stories and gathered every document they could find. Together, they compiled medical records, prescriptions, testimonies, and expert opinions. A team of journalists picked up the story and began publishing a series of reports. The truth started reaching more people. News channels covered the scandal, and online platforms helped the story spread fast. The doctor was officially named in the reports and was accused of using unethical methods and neglecting patient well-being. Authorities opened an official investigation, and the pressure grew. But none of it would have happened without the work Richard and Julia had done. They didn't stop after exposing the truth. They made sure it would be heard by everyone who needed to listen. As the world outside reacted, things inside the mansion were changing too, but in a different way. While journalists called and lawyers handled statements, Noah continued his quiet journey. His progress was steady. Julia began to notice his drawings. At first, they were just lines and shapes, but over time, colors started to appear. He used blue, yellow, and green. He chose the colors with care. Richard hung some of the drawings on the wall near the pool. One day, Noah said water while holding a crayon. Another day, he said sun while looking out the window. Then, unexpectedly, he said Mom. It was soft and quick, but Julia heard it. Richard heard it too. They both looked at each other, surprised and moved. These words didn't come from pressure or therapy. They came from Noah himself. The same boy who once lived in complete silence was now expressing thoughts, memories, and feelings. He wasn't being taught how to speak. He was simply being given space to grow. One afternoon, while Julia was organizing books and Richard was sitting nearby reading documents, Noah came into the room holding a piece of paper. He had been drawing with crayons for a while. Julia smiled and asked him if he wanted to show them. Noah walked slowly toward them, the paper in his small hands. He held it up, and they both leaned in. On the paper were 3 stick figures holding hands. One had short hair, one had long hair, and the third, in the middle, had a rounder face and curly lines on top of the head. It was clear to them what it meant. Julia crouched down and asked, "Who are these?" Noah looked at the drawing, then looked at both of them. "It's us," he said. His voice was soft, but the words were clear. Julia's eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth and nodded. Richard didn't speak. He just looked at the drawing, feeling something deep and overwhelming inside. Julia sat next to Noah on the floor and hugged him gently. Not too tight, just enough. He didn't pull away. He rested his head on her shoulder for a few seconds before going back to his crayons. Richard remained quiet, still watching. His heart was full. The silence he had once feared had turned into something beautiful. Not every day was perfect. Some days Noah was quiet again or didn't want to talk, but that was okay. The difference was that now they understood him. They knew how to listen, even when there were no words. Richard felt proud, not just of Noah, but of what they had built together. Julia had become more than just support. She was part of the family now. She had helped rebuild something he thought was lost forever. Their lives had changed. The house, once cold and quiet, had transformed into a space filled with color, noise, and real connection. There were still hard memories. The past didn't disappear. Sometimes Richard would look at the old medical files and feel the weight of guilt all over again. Julia still had moments where she remembered her daughter and felt the sting of that absence, but neither of them let the pain control their present. Instead, they used it to stay focused, to keep helping Noah and to protect others. They continued working with the other families, attending meetings, and providing updates on the case. They spoke at events, talked to support groups, and answered emails from people going through the same things they had faced. They didn't hide anymore. Noah's story was being used to help others. And in return, they received stories from parents who had found hope again. All of it reminded Richard and Julia that what they were doing mattered. They had turned something dark into something honest, something that would bring real change to many lives. Inside the house, things had never been more alive. The kitchen echoed with Noah's laughter when he liked a meal. The living room had toys, books, and colorful papers scattered across the floor. The hallway smelled like fresh paint, and Noah's art filled the walls. Music played in the background some days, and on others, they simply sat outside by the pool, listening to the sounds of water. Richard no longer avoided the memories of what was lost. Julia no longer hid her feelings, and Noah, the center of it all, had found his place in the world. He spoke a little, drew a lot, and smiled freely. That day when he showed them the drawing and said, "It's us," something shifted forever. It wasn't just a sweet moment, it was proof. The silence was no longer something to be afraid of. That house, once filled with loneliness and pain, now held voices, stories, and love. The past had left scars, but the present had become a home. The trial against the neurologist reached national attention faster than anyone expected. Once the first reports were broadcast, more families came forward, each with their own painful story. The courtroom was packed during the hearings. Parents described how their children had been misdiagnosed, over-medicated, or restrained without need. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records, expert testimonies, and official documents showed a clear pattern of neglect and abuse. Richard and Julia were present at every session. They spoke calmly, firmly, with all the truth they had collected. Journalists followed the case closely. Articles appeared daily. The public reaction was strong, and social media helped spread awareness even further. When the final verdict came, there was no doubt left. The doctor was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced. It was a moment of justice, not just for Noah, but for every child who had suffered in silence. Richard and Julia didn't celebrate loudly, but deep inside, they both felt a weight lift. Back at home, far from the courtroom chaos, life felt completely different. The mansion that once echoed with silence now had a soft hum of activity. Richard had made a decision shortly after the trial began. He converted one of the empty rooms into an art studio just for Noah. He painted the walls white and installed large windows so the sunlight could fill the space. There were shelves with paints, crayons, markers, and colored paper. A low table and chairs made it easy for Noah to sit and draw comfortably. Julia helped set everything up. The moment Noah walked into the room for the first time, his eyes lit up. He ran his fingers along the shelves, picked out a crayon, and began drawing. Since that day, it became his favorite place in the house. Each morning after breakfast, he would go straight to the studio. He drew shapes, people, animals, and especially the things he loved most: water, sun, and his favorite color, pool blue. Julia had become more than just part of the routine. She was part of the family. Her bond with Noah had only grown stronger. She knew when he needed quiet, when he was ready to try new things, and how to encourage him without pressure. Some days she sang while he drew. Other times they painted together or read books on the floor. Noah had started naming colors without being asked. Red, he'd say, pointing to a bright crayon. Yellow. Blue. He loved saying blue, but especially pool blue, his version of the soft turquoise shade of the water he adored. He'd press the crayon hard against the paper, scribbling it with excitement. Julia would smile and ask him to describe his drawings, and sometimes he did. Slowly, words became part of their games. Richard often stood quietly in the doorway watching them, sometimes with a cup of coffee in hand. He didn't interrupt. He just observed, grateful for the peace that had taken so long to arrive. Noah's world was no longer limited to therapy rooms and quiet hallways. He explored the garden, played with simple toys, and sometimes helped Julia bake cookies. He made messes, got paint on his clothes, and sang short, made-up songs while moving around the studio. His laughter filled the spaces that used to feel empty. Richard realized how much his home had changed. There were signs of life everywhere, art on the walls, toys under the table, books left open on the couch. It no longer looked like a museum. It felt lived in. It felt warm. Richard had started smiling more, not just out of politeness, but because he felt happy, truly happy. He had been through so much pain, silence, and guilt, but now his house was filled with the very thing he thought he had lost. Joy. Not perfect, not constant, but real. Julia and Noah had shown him that healing didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be honest. Without needing to say it out loud, the three of them had formed a new kind of family. There were no labels, no expectations. They had found comfort in small things, shared meals, quiet afternoons, and simple routines. Each had carried heavy memories from the past. But together, they were creating something new. Julia never tried to replace what had been lost, and Richard never asked her to. She was just there, present, steady. Noah responded to that with trust. One afternoon, he drew a picture of three people sitting in the sun. He pointed to the tallest and said, "Daddy," then to the one with long hair, "Julia," and finally, to the smaller one, "Me." Richard kept that drawing on his desk. It reminded him that love could grow even after everything else had fallen apart. It didn't have to look like anyone else's story. It just had to be real, and this, whatever it was real through and through. There was no final chapter, no perfect ending, but there was something better. Stability, a new rhythm, a peaceful home. Richard still had moments of doubt, sometimes remembering the years lost or the mistakes made. Julia still grieved her own pain quietly, but those moments didn't define them. What defined them now was the way they looked at each other at the dinner table, the way Noah reached for their hands when walking through the yard, the way their lives had blended naturally without needing to force anything. The house, once so cold and quiet, was now full of meaning. Paintings on the fridge, music from the speaker, a half-finished puzzle on the floor. Richard didn't need to chase answers anymore. He just needed to be present. And as he stood one afternoon watching Julia and Noah laugh together under the sun, he realized something simple. Love had arrived. Slowly, without noise. Not as a reward, but as a result of truth, care, and time. Years had passed since the days of quiet afternoons by the pool and finger painting in the studio. Noah was no longer the small boy who spoke only a few words and hid behind silence. He had grown into a confident young man with his own personality, interests, and voice. His story had slowly spread over time, first through friends, then community groups, then national media. People were inspired by how far he had come. Now, a large auditorium was filled with guests, families and professionals from across the country. They had come to celebrate stories of resilience and growth. Noah was one of the people being honored that evening. Dressed in a sharp blue suit, his favorite color, he waited backstage with Julia. He wasn't nervous, he was excited. His hands fidgeted a little, but his smile stayed wide. Julia looked at him with pride. She adjusted his collar, just like she used to fix his drawings years ago, gently, patiently, with love. When the moment came, Noah walked slowly onto the stage, holding Julia's hand. The audience stood up and applauded before he even reached the microphone. The stage lights shone brightly, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall, looking at the crowd without fear. Around his neck, a medal was placed, marking his journey, a symbolic moment for someone who had once been trapped in silence. Julia stood beside him, tears already forming in her eyes. Richard was in the front row, smiling proudly, his hands resting on his knees. But what came next caught everyone by surprise. The presenter cleared his throat and held up a paper. "Today," he said, "we honor not just Noah's journey, but the person who walked every step of it with him. Please join me in officially recognizing Julia Bennett as the adoptive mother and legal guardian of Noah Wakefield." For a second, the room went completely still. Then Julia covered her mouth with both hands as the emotion overwhelmed her. Julia had never asked for recognition. She had never imagined a title or ceremony. From the beginning, she had simply been there, for Noah, for Richard, for the little things that filled their lives. But standing there now, with the announcement echoing in her ears, she felt something shift. Noah turned to her and wrapped his arms around her. It wasn't just a hug, it was full of gratitude, trust, and deep love. Julia cried openly. Her whole body trembled and she couldn't stop the tears. She rested her forehead against Noah's, whispering, "Thank you." In the audience, Richard stood and began clapping. Others followed until the entire auditorium was on their feet. The applause was loud, long, and full of feeling. Julia and Noah stayed in that hug for several seconds before turning back toward the presenter. A photographer captured the moment, one that would appear in news articles and online posts as a symbol of care, patience, and unconditional love. After the announcement, the host handed Noah a small piece of paper. It was time for his speech. He walked toward the microphone, held the paper in both hands, and looked at the audience. He took a deep breath. Then, in a voice clear and calm, he said, "My light started at the pool." With her, he pointed to Julia and smiled. There were no complicated words, no long sentences, just that, simple and true. The room went completely silent. People held their breath. Even the cameras stopped clicking for a second. Then, as if all at once, the silence broke into loud applause, cheers, and even tears from some in the crowd. Richard wiped his eyes with a tissue and sat back down, overwhelmed with emotion. It was the moment he had dreamed of during the darkest years. And now it was real. Noah was not just being seen, he was being heard, celebrated and understood on his own terms. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the lobby. People lined up to meet Noah and Julia. Parents asked questions, teachers shared thanks, and strangers told them how deeply their story had touched them. Julia listened kindly, a little overwhelmed, but deeply moved. Noah smiled at each person, sometimes nodding, sometimes answering quietly. Richard joined them after a while and stood beside them, not as a businessman or a figure of power, but simply as Noah's father. The three of them stood together as a unit. It was clear to anyone watching that they were a family, bound not by blood, but by years of shared moments, hard choices, and slow victories. There were still challenges in Noah's life, of course. He still had days of quiet confusion and difficulty. But the difference now was that he wasn't alone. He had two people beside him who never stopped believing, even when the rest of the world didn't understand. The evening ended with laughter, photos, and one last round of applause as the family left the event together. They got into the car, Noah holding the medal in one hand and Julia's hand in the other. Richard drove, occasionally glancing back at them in the mirror. No one needed to say much. The silence between them was comfortable, full. When they got home, Noah placed the medal on the table next to one of his old drawings, the one with the three of them holding hands. Julia looked at it and smiled. Richard put his arm around her, and Noah leaned against both of them. That night, before bed, Julia tucked Noah in like she always did. As she turned off the light, he said softly, "Good night, Mom." She paused for a second, her heart full. "Good night, my love," she whispered. Outside, the world was quiet, but inside that house, where it all began, there was nothing left but love and peace. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.